Hello, AP Psychology students. I am unfortunately out today, so I wanted to put together this video in preparation for what you are missing when I am not here, so that we stay on pace. So today, we are going to be actually starting Unit 3, and it's actually Unit 3/4, and I'll talk about that in a second here. I know you guys are probably eager to see your tests and get those back, but just hang tight. I will make sure that we have a discussion about that as soon as I'm able to with you guys. So what we're going to do to start off class here is take a little bit of notes on Unit 3, so you guys can get your notebooks ready to go for that. Should only be about 20 minutes worth of lecture notes here. I've got a couple little demonstration example things, and then eventually you're going to be working on this assignment here called Sensation Survey for AP Psych. Very simple, just kind of a reflection on today's learning. A couple questions, just getting you to reflect on your different senses, which is going to be today's conversation, as well as a couple of questions, particularly number 6 down here, reflecting on some of the learning we're doing towards the end of the lecture notes. So if you want to follow along on your own Chromebook, you are welcome to do so. If you open up the classwork tab and scroll down, we are now into Unit 3. You'll see here it says Unit 3/4. That's because I'm combining sensation and perception along with learning. The reason behind that is if you were to look at the front of my room up there, you can see kind of the number of different objectives or specific standards connected to Unit 3 and 4. They're both relatively short. So this is kind of where we can save some time throughout the duration of the school year to get you guys prepared for your AP test in May. I actually combined these. So as I'll note in the notes here, if you open this up and follow along, we are combining units 3 and 4. So sensation and perception is today's conversation and will be for this week, as well as basically next week up until we get to that little break we have at the end of October. And then eventually we'll be getting into learning, which is also known as behaviorism. And this will also help equal weighting between first and second semester. There are 9 units, and that doesn't really evenly split up between first and second semester. So by combining these two, we can stick with kind of 4 units in the beginning, 4 units in the second semester. What that also means for your purposes, we will just have a quiz on sensation and perception, just like we do with every single one of our units, where we get about halfway through and then we take a quiz and then we move on and then take a test. So as you can see here, we'll be moving through the basics of sensation and perception today. Tomorrow we'll actually carry on with that. On Wednesday of this week, we'll get into vision, and then we'll talk about hearing and our other senses Thursday, Friday, into early next week. Your quiz should be right before that October break, so this should be next week, Wednesday. Then we'll pick up with learning and behaviorism. So classical conditioning and operant conditioning, we'll learn about what those things are. That'll be the first or the Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday of the last week of October, right around Halloween. And then something called observational learning. Your Unit 3 test on everything, though, so sensation and perception along with behaviorism, that'll be into the first weeks of November here, okay? So today we are talking about the basic concepts of what's called sensation and perception. We're going to learn about what those two terms mean, how they're different from each other, go through some things about what are called thresholds, as well as some basics of perception, something called bottom-up versus top-down perception. So sensation and perception. So when we're talking about sensation and perception, we are talking about two processes that are related to each other, but they are different from one another. So when we say sensation, what we are talking about is the pure physical receptors of our nerve system receiving stimuli. So on our fingertips and other parts of our body, we have nerve endings that can pick up touch. Inside our nose, we have what are called olfactory receptor neurons. In our eyes, we have rods and cones, etc. Whatever the sense is, whether we're talking smell, touch, taste, that is the sensation process where they're actually physically being stimulated and receiving those neurological signals. Perception, on the other hand, is how our brain organizes and interprets that information and makes sense of it. So it's reliant on sensation. Sensation has to happen first, and then we perceive what we are sensing. And that process can sometimes be altered. So one of the things we'll be talking about in today's conversation, and we'll get into this kind of over the course of several days here, is that perception can sometimes be deceiving, right? That we don't always perceive that what we're actually sensing. This gets into certain things like illusions, things that we miss with our lack of focused attention. There's a number of different things where when we organize, interpret information, when we perceive, it's not always determined based solely on sensation. There's also a thinking process involved. The process by which you move from sensation to perception is something called transduction. So to transduce means to move from sensation to perception. So for example, in your ears, we'll be learning about hearing or audition eventually. So hearing involves sound waves that come into your ear, and it vibrates your eardrum, and there's these tiny little bones in there called ossicles, and those vibrate as well. That whole vibration process that works through your inner ear, that's the sensation. That's just the pure physical sensation of vibrations caused by sound waves that are moving through the air. Perception then is when that sound waves gets kind of converted into a neurological signal that your brain can make sense of. And if you remember from our last unit, it would be making sense in your temporal lobe on the side, because your temporal lobe is where you process hearing and auditory information. So that process is called perception, and transduction is just the movement from that physical vibration to the neurological signal where now your brain can make sense of it. Okay, so that's my example down here that goes with that. All right. So sensation perception, we're going to be talking about both in this unit. Sensation is all about the physical aspects. You are going to need to know some basics of kind of how the eye works, how the ear works, nose, mouth. Perception then is more psychological processes about thinking about how our brain makes sense of those sensations. All right, so that gets us to what are called thresholds. And this will actually be something that we'll spend more time on tomorrow when I'm back together with you guys. We're going to be doing some little experimentation with our what are called absolute thresholds. So I'm going to be breaking guys into small groups and doing little experiments to test your sense of smell, taste, sight, and vision, I believe, or sight and vision are the same thing. I think there are 4 senses that we're looking at, and I don't remember which 4 it is right now, but we'll unpack that tomorrow. So this will just be for lecture note purposes, but I'll come back to this and reiterate some of these things because we're going to do some experimentation with this tomorrow. So when it comes to sensation, the basics of sensation, like how do we smell something, taste something, hear something? The first thing to note is that to notice the stimuli, to notice the sensation, it's got to cross what's called a threshold, specifically the absolute threshold. When it's the absolute threshold, it means the minimum amount of a stimulus necessary to detect it, and it says 50% of the time. The reason it's 50% is because sometimes we're not sure if we sense something. Like if I say, can you taste this? And you're like, I think so, I'm not sure. Or do you see that over there and you're trying to make it out? Or do you smell that and you're sensing for a smell and you're trying to pick it out? More than 50% is because it's not just guessing 50-50, right? It's kind of like, okay, I am certain that I now smell this, or I now taste this, or I now see that. So the absolute threshold is the minimum amount of stimulus necessary to tell something exists. And it can be affected by a number of different things. So this is what's called the signal detection theory. So to tell if a signal exists, to detect a signal, a stimuli, each person's absolute threshold depends on a number of things. So first of all, things like experience. Have you smelt it before? Have you tasted it before? If you don't know what you're smelling for, you don't know what you're tasting for, sometimes it can be a little bit more difficult to actually pick that out. Your expectations. If I say this is going to taste amazing and you're kind of processing that information, you're expecting something to taste great, you're more likely to pick out maybe a better tasting flavor. Or if I am telling you what to expect from what you're supposed to see or what you're supposed to hear, that can shape the way that we sense that information. Motivation. Do you care? Right? If I say, can you smell that? But you're like barely awake and you're just kind of like, oh, I don't know. Whether or not you're motivated can actually affect whether or not you absolutely, if it crosses this absolute threshold. And then just generally how alert you are. Sometimes we can have what's called subliminal perception, which is detecting stimuli that is actually below your absolute threshold, below our level of awareness. We think we are smelling something, we think we are hearing something, when in reality it's not actually there. And that's what we call subliminal perception. And this can happen for a number of different reasons, but a lot of it is psychological, right? It's kind of based on our experiences, based on our expectations. We can think that something is there. And when reality, the senses, the sensation is not actually happening, which is kind of fascinating. So we'll talk more about absolute threshold tomorrow. Here are some examples of them, and we're not going to recreate every single one of these, but vision. This was on your true false activity, actually, on one of the first days in here. Apparently, that you can see the average person, I should say, with corrected vision and everything, so you don't need to worry about them, not being able to see because they're not wearing their glasses. But assuming they have 20/20 vision, you can see a candle from about 30 miles away on a dark, clear night. And this is with the caveat of that you're up really high, kind of overlooking things, because obviously 30 miles away, the curvature of the earth, you're not going to be able to see anything 30 miles away. But if you were like on top of a skyscraper in Chicago looking 30 miles into the distance and it was perfectly clear and dark, you can see the tiny little bit of a candle. Hearing the ability to hear a clock tick, that's the other one we're going to test tomorrow. I've got a clock in the front of my classroom, and we're going to test your ability to hear that in the HLR from a certain distance. We're not going to do touch, but you can feel a fly by you about a centimeter away. Anything further, you usually can't feel that. Smell, this is about perfume. And then the other one we'll do tomorrow is with sugar in water. So testing just the teeniest amount of sugar, can you start to detect that it doesn't just taste like normal water, but it starts to taste a little bit sweet. So when it crosses your absolute threshold, that means you are starting to sense that it actually exists. Okay. So that's one type of threshold. Another type of threshold is called the difference threshold. And the difference threshold is what is the amount of stimulus that needs to be added to a situation to tell that there was a difference, to tell that there's a change. Okay. So the difference threshold actually changes depending on the amount of stimulus that's already there. And this gets into what's called Weber's law. So this was something that was studied by Ernest Weber. It's Weber's law, I guess, technically. So Weber's law or Weber's law, also studied by his counterpart, Gustav Fechner. But Weber is the more important one, Weber's law or Weber's law. And what's happening with Weber's law, is that the just noticeable difference, which is the amount of difference threshold that it takes to tell if a stimulus has changed, is based on a percentage or a proportion, not a constant amount. So I like to use this example. When you are going to be tomorrow putting tiny bits of sugar into water, stirring it up, and you're going to take sips of it and try to decide, does it exist? Is it there? Can I taste the sweetness? It'll take several pinches of sugar. Eventually, it'll cross your absolute threshold, right? But once you actually do notice the sweetness, how much more sugar would I need to add to tell that, oh, now this definitely does taste sweeter? The more sugar you add, the more you're going to have to add in order to tell that there's actually a change. So, for example, if I went from, just a barely amount of sweetness and then I put in a teaspoon of sugar, I'm definitely going to notice the change, right? Because I'm going from barely any sugar to a decent amount of sugar. You're going to be able to notice that change for sure. But if I take something like a sugary drink like Mountain Dew or some sort of like heavily sugared drink, right, that's already very sugary, and I put in one more teaspoon of sugar, I actually might not notice that change, right? Even though it's the same amount of sugar, a teaspoon here and a teaspoon in water, you're not necessarily going to notice the difference in the same way. That's what Weber's law is arguing. You have to think in terms of percentage, because when you move from, like, let's say a sugar level of 1, and then you add in, I don't know, 10 grams of sugar, going from 1 to 10, that's a tenfold increase, right? That's like I think a 1000% increase. But if you're already at 100 grams of sugar, or we'll say 50 grams of sugar, because I think actually soda does have close to 50 grams. If you're already at 50 grams of sugar and you add another 10 grams, right? You're going from 50 to 60. That's not a 1000% increase. I can't do math. That's something like, we'll say 20. I think it's a 20% increase. So it's a much smaller percentage increase. Okay. Another example sometimes I like to use is when you're weightlifting. If you're going from lifting, let's say you're bench pressing, I don't know, 100 pounds. Okay. We'll just make it a nice even number. And you go from bench pressing 100 to 110, only adding about 10 pounds, 5 pounds on each side. Sometimes it's actually hard to notice that change. It'll feel kind of the same. And you're moving up about 10 pounds. But on the other side, if you're lifting only 10 pounds and then you go from 10 to 20, that's now a 100% increase, 10 to 20. You're going to notice that change a lot more easily. So when it comes to the difference threshold, you want to think in terms of percentage and proportionality, not the actual amount. When it comes to noticing changes, if something is very bright already, noticing even more brightness is hard. But going from barely any brightness to, a decent amount of brightness, easier to tell. Going from a volume level of like 5 on your speaker up to 10, that's a 100% increase. Easier to tell that difference than when it's already at 50 on your volume level and you go from 50 to 55 because it's a smaller percent. So that's what Weber's law is arguing. And I'll show you a video example of this later that goes with that. We'll save it for next time. All right. One other thing before we talk a little bit about perception. When it comes to sensation, another kind of interesting phenomenon is called sensory adaptation. So once something meets your absolute threshold, once you notice it actually exists, um, obviously you can tell it exists, right? It crossed your absolute threshold. However, prolonged exposure to it, in other words, if you keep smelling it, you keep tasting it, you keep hearing it, you can eventually start to just kind of tune that sensory information out. Our brain is kind of like, it works in a way in which we try to notice differences, right? We notice change. And if you get used to something, this is what we call sensory adaptation. So you can just like stop noticing sounds. If you have like a fan on when you sleep at night, which I do, or you have some background noise going on, eventually you might just stop noticing, or the sound of the road, right? When you're driving, you notice maybe the sound of when you're accelerating and increasing onto the highway, but eventually after a while you just like tune that out and you stop noticing it. That's because you've adapted to it. This is called sensory adaptation. You stop smelling smells. When you first enter a room, you're like, oh, the oil diffuser smells totally like, lemon in here. But after a minute or two or three, you start sniffing, you don't really smell that anymore. You can leave the room and come back in and then smell it again, but your nose kind of gets used to a smell, okay, after a little bit. Which is why maybe your parents get on you for cleaning up your room because it smells terrible in there. But if you've been sitting in there a long time, you're like, I don't know, it doesn't smell too bad to me. You get used to it. That's sensory adaptation. And probably one of my favorite ones with touch. You don't feel your socks anymore, right? I assume most of you are wearing socks right now. You felt the socks when you pulled them on. But after a little bit of wearing those clothes, whatever the clothes might be, you stop noticing the feel of those clothes. So you stop noticing your socks until now, because now I'm talking about it. Now all of a sudden you're thinking about it, and now you are noticing the feel of your socks. So you can become aware and unaware, and then aware again. But that unawareness based on prolonged sensation is called sensory adaptation. You just kind of get used to it. So we're going to do these absolute threshold experiments tomorrow. I'm going to save them because they're kind of involved, and I didn't want the sub to have to figure out how to navigate that. I'll walk you through that process tomorrow. But with the time we have left, we're just going to talk about what are the 5 main senses. There's actually 7 total, 2 body senses, and I'll talk briefly about that. And then I'm going to introduce one last concept, show you a demonstration, and then you get some time on this worksheet. So there are 5 main senses, and you guys are well aware of this, right? There's vision, audition, which is another word for hearing, smell, taste, and touch. And we'll go through each one of them over the course of this unit. But then you also have these body senses, which are called the kinesthetic and vestibular sense. And we'll define these later on, but just briefly here, the kinesthetic sense, this is your body sense. This is body movement. So it's kind of like the ability to walk down the hallway and you're about to run into someone's shoulder and you know to kind of like dodge them or step aside. That's your kinesthetic sense. And I'll do some other demonstrations with that later on too. Vestibular sense, this is actually inside your ears. You have something called the vestibular system inside your inner ear. And it's some fluid that helps figure out balance so that when you spin in circles sometimes or you go end over end tumbling, when you get up, the fluid in your inner ear is kind of like getting all wobbly and weird, trying to stabilize back out. Your sense of disorientation and lack of balance, that is the vestibular sense. So knowing how to keep upright, knowing which way is up, that's the vestibular sense. So those are 2 of your body senses. Okay. Tomorrow we'll start getting into a little bit more on vision, certainly on Wednesday. By Thursday and Friday this week, we'll get into audition. Smell, taste, and touch is relatively really short when it comes to notes. There's not a ton there. And same with the kinesthetic and vestibular sense. Those will wrap up quickly. Okay, so this is the last piece of information for today, and then I'll show you some examples of this. So all of that we've talked about, absolute threshold, difference threshold, that's all about sensation. As we move into perception, which is how our brain organizes our understanding of the world, one important concept with that, and we'll be exploring this further later, is called bottom-up versus top-down processing. So when I say bottom-up processing, what I mean by that is when it comes to sensing the world around me, sometimes I don't know what I'm sensing for, right? Like if I was blindfolded and someone said, just reach out and touch this, I don't know what I'm expecting to feel, right? So I'm doing kind of this haptic perception where I'm touching things, trying to figure out what's going on with my sensation. Maybe I can smell it. Maybe I can kind of crunch it and I can hear the texture. When I'm doing all of that, I'm doing what's called bottom-up processing. When you don't have an idea in your mind of what it's supposed to be, and you're just told to go start sensing it, and then that sensation kind of builds until your brain works up to an understanding. That's bottom up. So bottom up meaning you start with sensation and work up towards perception. Okay. The opposite is called top down processing. And top down processing, it starts up here, it starts on the top. You're told something. You're like told maybe, hey, it smells like chocolate chip cookies out in the hallway. Go smell. And then you go out there and you realize, oh my gosh, it does smell like chocolate chip cookies. When you have an idea in your mind of what something's supposed to smell like, taste like, what it's supposed to, look like, and that idea is influencing your perception, it's influencing your thought, that allows your stimuli to kind of pick up on, sorry, allows sensation organs to pick up on what you're trying to sense. And that's top down perception, all right, or top down processing. So we are constantly doing both of these things. Sometimes we're sensing the world around us without an idea of what's going on, and we kind of come to a conclusion of what we're trying to sense. And other times we're doing more top down, where we have an idea already of what it's supposed to look like, smell like, taste like, and then we work our way down to actually sense those tastes or smells or sights. One great example of the difference between bottom up versus top down processing is this audio thing called backmasking. And we'll maybe do a couple more of these together because they're really fun. But I'm going to give you an example of this, and then you're going to have to, on the worksheet in a second here, come up with your own examples that aren't this. So backmasking is this idea that songs might have hidden meanings in them in reverse. So I'll just show you a couple of these, but this website, which I do have linked in here if you want to mess around with this later on your own, but I'll do a couple more examples of this. All of these are kind of just like little clips of the song going forward and then clips of the song going backwards. Okay. We'll do Hotel California first here. Um, so the first thing you're going to hear is just the song forward, and then you're going to hear the song in reverse. And my objective for you as you listen to this is try to pick out, is there a hidden message going backwards? So here it is going forward. Okay, now this is backwards. So what you're doing right now is bottom up perception. You don't have an idea of what you're supposed to be hearing. You're just kind of listening for things and you're trying to piece it together, starting at the bottom, starting at audition sensation and working your way up. So here it is backwards. Do it one more time. Try listen again. Do you hear words? Okay, so I've done this many times because I've taught this class multiple times. So I can't get those backwards lyrics out of my head. And if I was in class with you right now, I would take opinions. What do you think you're hearing? You can talk it out with the people next to you. But and I don't know why they always do this in songs that are backwards, but it's always a lot about like Satan and stuff like that. So this one is Satan hears this. He had me believe in him. So here are the reverse lyrics. I'll zoom in a little bit more so you can see it a little bit better. Satan, he hears this. He had me believe in him. So now you're going to be doing what's called top down perception. Listen for these lyrics. So there you go. Satan hears this. He had me believe in him. I don't know if you were able to follow that as you heard it, but if you were, and all of a sudden you're like, oh my gosh, it was there that whole time, that would be a great example of top down perception. We'll do another one over here. I like some Eminem here. So here it is going forward, normal. Okay, now here it is in reverse. Again, see if you can pick up on any words. We're doing bottom up perception right now, just kind of listening and seeing what we can hear. Okay, so here's what you maybe heard. Some people, when they hear this, they're like, "Did he say cinnamon?" I swear he said cinnamon, but I don't know if he did this on purpose because it is pretty clever if he did. But one of his nicknames is Slim Shady, right? So it is Slim, it's Eminem. So here you go. Watch for these words. Now you're going to be doing top down perception because now you have this idea in your mind and you're perceiving it. Pretty cool, right? That once you have that perception in your mind, once you have that thought in your mind, now you're doing this top down perception. I'll do one last one here. I'm trying to remember which one's another good one, and I can do a couple others. Um, we'll do paparazzi, Lady Gaga. Can't go wrong, right? So here it is forward, and here it is in reverse. So now we're doing bottom up perception because we're just trying to listen and pick up things. All right, I'll give you one more chance at that. Okay, so again, I don't know if you pick up on like the satanic aspects of it, but it's evil save us. The stars above, above. We model it on the arts of Lucifer. Here you go. Okay, so again, these are not actually there, as far as I'm aware. They did not purposely create these things like that. People are playing music in reverse and like picking up on little things and be like, oh my gosh, you hear this? And they put that in. And then once you do hear it, it's kind of hard to unhear it, right? That's kind of the whole idea of like when you see an image, it's hard to unsee that image. So, like this image right here, a lot of people see the rose, but there's also two people kissing in the middle. Once you have that top down perception idea in your mind, it's impossible to unsee the people kissing, right? So that's the difference between bottom up, top down. Bottom up is all about starting with your basic sensation, working your way up to a conclusion. Top down is you start with an idea in mind, and then you allow your sensation, sensory organs to pick up what you're trying to sense for. All right. So here's what we're going to do to end class. In Google Classroom, there's this posted right here, sensation survey for the AP Psych. The sub will also come around with paper versions for anyone that wants it. And what you're going to be doing on this is pretty straightforward. There's just a couple questions, and we'll discuss them and see what we thought collectively as class next time, but still try to get it turned in by the end of class. There's a couple questions on which senses you would keep, which would you get rid of, how would you rank them, why, and then does knowing about the vestibular and kinesthetic sense, which I talked about briefly, but I reminded you of them right here, does that change your ranking at all? And at the very end here, talk this through with someone next to if you need to, but otherwise come up with your own example of bottom up versus top down processing. So don't use the music in reverse because I just gave you that example, but try to come up with your own version of when have you in your personal life used bottom up versus top down processing when it comes to perceiving the world around us. All right. When you are done with this, you can go ahead and put it in the bin. Tomorrow, we will come back and learn more about these absolute thresholds, and we'll do some experimentation that goes with it, along with probably adding just a few slides to your notes. All right. Email me if you do have questions. Hope you guys are doing well, and I'll see you later.